Is your existing supply chain and logistics consultancy provider failing to deliver? Our experienced, thought-leading team at Laguru could be your choice for an intelligent and friendly professional supply chain. If you have a challenge in supply chain, procurement or logistics, or maybe just want to improve the value you get from them, visit laguru.co.uk. Complete end-to-end satisfaction guaranteed.
Coming up in this episode.
That sort of brings something into mind, which is all about the labels or the logos, however you describe it, where it's, have we got this new client? Have we got a new piece of business? That's the kind of holy grail of a tender response, is we've won a 5-year multi-location contract with X customer.
The Logistics Collective podcast is a series focused on the logistics industry, where there are many incredible stories to be told. We'll be speaking with those who've worked and are working within the industry today. What have been their experiences, good and bad, since joining, and would they recommend a career in the industry to others? Here's your host, Malcolm Pope.
Hello again, and welcome to another episode of Logistics Collective, the podcast. You're going to be delighted that we've got another episode of Alas with Keith Holdsworth of Perfection Group. Hi Keith, how are you keeping?
Hello Malcolm, I'm very well, thank you. Seems like quite a while since we did one of these, but yes, keeping very well in the interim.
It's not through lack of respect, love and care for you, Keith. We've both been pretty damn busy, and we're now sort of involved with Tompkins Ventures, aren't we?
Oh yes, yeah, that's been a recent addition to the portfolio of work. I'm really excited with it, actually.
Yeah, me too.
I think there's some fabulous opportunities for being able to fix people's problems by pointing them to the right people to solve them. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to that.
It is sort of true that quite often you can perhaps be sitting there trying to puzzle and solve a problem yourself, when perhaps a simple call would give you a quicker route to actually finding something that helps you out a lot quicker. But let's sort of move on from a tiny bit of mini marketing. Always delighted to do the fantastic Jim Tompkins a little bit of a favour. But our question today is, can our logistics service providers prosper when they have single-figure percentage profitability? And I think when we look broadly at the larger logistics service providers, there's not any that I can think of, and please come and disabuse us, that have got much more than low single-figure percentage EBITDA. What's your view, Keith?
Well, I am completely and utterly aligned with that perspective, Malcolm. Maybe I should right up front here say that I have never actually worked for a logistics service provider. I've always been on the customer side of that relationship, receiving services, paying bills to them, and generally trying to work out how we can save money collectively. But yeah, my inclination is to suggest that single figure margin and low single figure margin is generally speaking the way of the world for LSPs, for a number of reasons, of course. It's a intensely competitive marketplace. And you can understand where that leads you into an awful lot of pressure to not necessarily charge what could look like an over healthy profit margin, because frankly, the way that we go and tender for these services, somebody will come along and undercut you. So the way that market has developed is one that doesn't encourage companies to be able to achieve a higher margin.
So I've worked for a few logistics service providers, and I guess I've had the good fortune when I have to either work on contracts or for business that were either, profitable because it had an awful lot of added value operations within there, and maybe stretching into double figure percentage as a profit figure, but probably then looking at the macro view, you would look at the logistics service provider and still find those low single figure percentage profitability. But also having worked for some more specialist businesses that had certainly at the time, much higher double-figure percentages, because they were doing something that was relatively new, unique and specialist. And it was probably before the commoditisation effect took place, that you get what is new and novel and interesting commoditises, which is a shame. But we do know, it's a matter of public record, that logistics service providers do sadly only achieve single-figure percentage in level of profitable. But do we think that's enough for them? Is that what their aspirations should be set at?
Well, I mean, you're a shareholder in the business, or, as even just as a receiver of the services, companies that are operating low single-digit margin are obviously, financially probably in quite a precarious position. You certainly wouldn't want to be contracting with someone who, maybe because there are certain factors that they don't necessarily feel as if they can control so well in terms of costs and things, that, they could tip from profitability to positions of sort of losing money month on month. And you just get to a stage where, if that means that they're going to go bust and they're going to drop out of the services, then, that's actually a really big risk for me as a client of an LSP. And, you do see quite a number of small to medium businesses that are sort of disappearing from the radar right now, just as a result of the fact that maybe they haven't been able to adjust some of their cost base in this sort of recent market dynamic that we've had. And that's clearly unfortunate for the people that are working there and obviously the receivers of their services. So, you've got great deals of people as a result. But I do tend to think that maybe if you look at the different services they provide, then certain services you could kind of consider to be a little bit more stable and therefore perhaps operate on lower margins. But on others, you feel like, I mean, you mentioned it yourself, added value operations. I'm as guilty as the next man of going and arguing with an LSP about, I only want to pay 3% margin on my warehouse in terms of storage, because that's a really kind of flat cost that is well known and you're not doing anything with it. And therefore, there's an expectation that you might make a very low margin on that. But if I then look at things like contract manufacturing, where you might be bringing maybe some kitting operations into your warehouse facility that inevitably make a great deal of sense, because you're not paying for trucks to move the material to an off-site location to maybe bundle two things together and then pay them for the labor, pay for the packaging, and then put it on another truck and bring it back into your warehouse again. That process is inevitably very costly and inefficient. Whereas doing those services in-house, there's arguably an opportunity to charge a lot more margin for something like that. And, that is still going to be a win for me as the customer, because I don't have to pay for the freight, but it's also a win for them as a provider of some contract packing services now. That's probably a business which can maybe warrant 10 to 20% margin or something. So I think there's a mixture of what you feel as if you can and you can't manage to survive on small margins. But the key bit that I've missed out there is obviously transportation and freight. And I think that's also an area where freight and the optimization of freight is the key place where I think you might traditionally be able to be achieving small margin, but it's the key place where there is such an optimization, and there's another layer of optimization that can come within that type of business, which inevitably could grow the margin and yet at the same time perhaps not add cost in a way that it needed to be passed on to the client. But then we're talking about percentage margin as opposed to absolute gross margin, because fundamentally you're trying to save an awful lot of money out of doing those services. So I think maybe by breaking it into those three areas, maybe there is a slight difference for the way that they need to structure the business.
And I think what I would say is, taking a future view, I'm going to go out on a limb, and as a former buyer of logistics services, and it's still elements of buying that we do today for our clients. I don't believe that LSPs are making enough profit. And when I begin to think about what might be the root causes, I mean, I've got to take my share of the responsibility as a buyer that's run literally hundreds of sourcing events for all types of logistics services. Am I looking at price only? And the answer to that is no. And in fact, even beyond that, more emphatically, it is never. I've never looked at price only. It's always been a value proposition that has been searching for. So it's optimized value and low risk. So I need to be persuaded to make a change that let's say the new incoming provider can satisfy me that they will manage that risk of change very ably. But beyond the activities of those appalling people like myself that have been buyers, and not all buyers are appalling, and I don't think I'm particularly appalling either. But what do we think the other root causes are? What would you imagine?
We've gone through a cycle where we've kind of educated LSPs to respond in a certain way. And I think that to the outsider, it feels as if they will look after trying to acquire business, but on the basis of, well, it's got to be good for me to have more business because that will allow me to reduce my central overhead cost as a proportion of a bigger business. So they're trying to do something which probably barely touches the needle, but they're trying to do something that says scale is going to be important. And that sort of brings something into mind, which is all about the labels or the logos, however you describe it, where it's just, have we got this new client? Have we got a new piece of business? That's the kind of holy grail of a tender response is we've won a 5-year multi-location contract with X customer. But what I don't think that they do particularly good job at, and the reason, and I should just say that the reason why it feels as if there's a really low margin in here is because they are also terrified of losing a logo or a label. And that sort of forces this dynamic to rip out an awful lot of maybe there's some development that they might be able to make that might help them to become more efficient to improve their margin, but they just take away some of those development programs because they can't afford them almost because they've kept their margin so low. But on the reverse of that, I don't think that they really go after new business understanding enough about what's the existing business that they've got. So, do they look at the flows in their network, which are particularly difficult to achieve? Maybe they force, we believe that there are so much empty running, the movements that are only partially full vehicles, but do they really understand that to the extent that says, you know what, if I've got this piece of business in this category, I don't know, maybe let's take it's a food manufacturing company. Actually, the best people that they could probably merge with are there any other food manufacturing companies out there? Because they're going to be going to very similar destinations. And therefore, there's a bigger opportunity for them to positively target the responses that they are going to try to win on the understanding that the network that they're going to have as a result of that has probably got a higher potential for them to optimize it. I don't think they look at it in that way. It doesn't feel as if they look at it in that way. It just feels as if they try to go after any new business is good, and let's not. And then after we've won it, we'll work out how to put it into the network. I don't know whether that's a sense that maybe you've had over the years, Malcolm. It certainly feels to me as if you start up an operation and then you're trying to do work with them to say, well, where can we make this more efficient? Rather than it should almost be embedded as part of the response. It's like, well, we've looked at your flows already and we can tell you where it's going to come with confidence because we really understand it. And I think that's just a different logic to the tendering process. Maybe we've always provided the same information, but maybe the third-party logistics providers don't ask for the right information from us.
I think the whole interaction between logistics service providers and their customers is something that is, how would I describe it politely? Suboptimal, in my view, for a whole number of reasons. But come back to your view. Do I think it is about capturing new flags and new logos to put on the map, as it were? I think there is a lot of that. I don't think our logistics service providers are so naive as to not look at the value that they can get from, whether it be reputationally or otherwise, in terms of by winning pieces of business. And of course, some pieces of businesses are more interesting than others. I think it is going for scale. I think the potential area of attention that should be given is to look at balance scale. Do you understand the impact of this new piece of business that you're heading for? Do you understand how that is going to impact your network overall? Because the keynote really is these large logistics service providers that will have hundreds and thousands of clients within there. Your hope is that by using these big brands that they are effectively leveraging their scale and they're optimizing. Because if we perhaps think at a headline level, what do logistics service providers do? And this is a very headline level. Well, I would say at their core, they're all about people. And it is a massive focus of attention that even in spite of automation, the logistics industry is always going to be about its people. And of course, there are struggles in terms of getting people into the industry. I think its reputation and the efforts put in by things like Generation Logistics are beginning to shift the needle as far as that is concerned. I think the second element is about assets and asset management. So whether those be vehicles or sheds or indeed MHE or anything else that is under ownership, that they are managing those assets in the most appropriate way possible. I think there's a third element which is all about optimisation, which is about being as efficient and sustainable and profitable as they can be. And the fourth and final element really probably is there's a whole lot of buying going on. So I've always known that the largest amount of logistics procurement that is going on is occurring within the logistics service providers. And I do have a question in my mind in terms of how effective is this? And could it be more effective, more appropriately? And that, for me, is perhaps one of those key other points. So the first is, how do I actually balance, how do I actually go and target my activities to understand not just what is, okay, I've grown my business, but also how does it fit with what I've got already? How does it move me forward? And then when I'm doing that, how effective am I really in terms of how I'm buying? Do you agree, Keith?
Yeah, I think so. Just picking up on that buying point, I think that there are, with the advances in technology and being able to analyze market rates using AI and being able to understand, how much am I likely to have to pay, I think there is somehow a connection between the fact that you're wanting a predictable price as a customer. So what tends to happen is that at the onset of an agreement, you'll probably create some sort of freight matrix of weight versus distance, pretty much. There's lots of different manifestations of it, but it's pretty much weight versus distance, or volume, cubic volume versus distance. And what doesn't really happen is the fact that you will generally have a fuel index on that process, but there are other costs which are influential in there, and setting those at an appropriate level and being able to adjust for them. So things like, what's really going on with labor, what's really going on with maintenance and repair, what's really going on with my freight admin cost and fuel, obviously. I think that being able to have some sort of more dynamic approach to what's going on with those costs, therefore, what should I be paying for this service? And being able to translate that into, well, then there's a market availability dynamic and you've got something that says, well, where are my real hotspots of where I think I should be paying this, and I'm actually paying an awful lot more because somehow there isn't a service available. Maybe somebody has just dropped out of business and that covered a particular leg. So there's something in and amongst the charging mechanism which could be a bit, a lot more dynamic now, and kind of almost evolve into a new generation. I don't think it's just an open book costing thing. I think it's just more understanding that there are market levers, and you just need to understand how that contributes to the cost that you've got, and therefore how much margin are you going to make. And maybe there's stages of just agreeing what those percentage margins are. But by doing that in a relationship, in a proper sort of supplier-customer relationship model, then actually you've probably got more chance of working together to try to improve the percentage margin, because you're going to work on the same areas together, because that can be a shared objective, rather than, I think it's there's quite a siloed impact, quite confrontational in some respects between people wanting to bake in enough money to allow for the fact that something might go different in the real world and I don't want to lose money, versus someone who's really wanting to take advantage and be the lowest cost that I can get. But actually, I just got to you've got to create a trade-off almost in there and create a little bit of a shared objective for the partnership to achieve. And I think that buying, there's a great deal of murkiness, shall we say. So there's not really very much transparency that goes on with that buying process. And yet it could be a lot more open, I think.
I mean, I'd certainly support that. I mean, I've always imagined what would have been my perfect logistics service provider. And my perfect logistics service provider, it wouldn't be about open book, it would have been open palm. And what do I mean by open palm? It would be share the visibility of your buying process and your optimization process, and how effectively you're targeting business in order to rebalance your network. And I might be happy actually turning around and saying, well, on that basis of that visibility, I'll want to guarantee you a higher level of profit margin than you're currently reporting as a business overall. But there's an awful lot of this that comes into, it's about the added value that is created. And I think there is something that goes against the involvement of procurement from the LSP customers in terms of that buying decision process. And, the note of caution always is never make a decision on a tariff alone. A tariff is only one of many influencing factors in terms of the final cost that you're going to pay. And really a true sourcing process for getting the right outsourced logistics operation is really, it's like a major intelligence test. It's a risk assessment. It is really looking closely at the ability of a potential future partner to create value on an ongoing basis, not just the here and now and what the tariff is telling me. I can say, across those hundreds of tenders, I have never, let's say on a national distribution tender, I have never, ever, ever selected the lowest cost. I've never, because in general, you can get to a point that those that with the lowest cost very often have misunderstood the question, but similarly so of those of the higher cost as well. But I sort of look at it, there are potentially a number of root causes within there, and maybe at some point we will get some denizen of the logistics industry that is free and able to comment and come and explain things from their side of the table, which I'd be really interested to hear about. But I think we've covered perhaps what might be a number of root causes really within there. Maybe another root cause is, LSP sales too focused on volume growth rather than profit growth. When is the right time to step away and say no, which is always interesting. But looking at that single figure percentage, I mean, let's be really, really clear. The logistics service providers, both great and small, are absolutely critical for the well-being of UK PLC and global PLC as well. They really are the vascular system and arguably on occasions the nervous system of the corporate body. By what they do enables everybody to be able to have the things that they need and to have everything else that they need as well. Whether it be you're going into hospital, well, guess what? Everything in there's been delivered on the back of a truck. If you're going on holiday, well, again, similarly, there's a logistics operation that makes sure that happens. And I sort of look at this and say, I always view it as a wondrous subject area because otherwise I wouldn't have spent so long being fascinated by it. But what do we think is the impact of this sort of lack of profitability? And let me set that against some forward headwinds. We already know that we are trying to make a journey towards net zero, and that is going to need investment, and it's going to need some real intelligence overlaying that to make it all hang together. So that's one area of challenge. The second area of challenge is that in order for the logistics industry to get the arms and legs and brains engaged with it, then it has to offer meaningful and well-rewarded careers if it is perhaps to reverse some of this trend away from it. And so you may be looking at how do you actually reshape how supply chains work, not just on the basis of, well, it's the lowest cost, but actually it is the best sustainable option. And I'm using sustainability in its broadest sense, which isn't just about emissions and energy utilisation, but it's also about the good and well-being of the workforce as well, let's say, within that. So they've got a challenge really in terms of that. And I think the third pillar challenge is almost an acceleration of ever demanding customer base, ever more demanding customer base. And that we've seen whole new sales channels created over the last 10 to 20 years, all of which, on a unit cost basis, the new ones has developed, are arguably more expensive than doing it in the old-fashioned way. And all of which have layers of additional complexity in order to be able to manage. Now, within that complexity, for sure, there's some opportunity within there. What I would then go and have a look at, perhaps that paucity of profitability, does it lead us automatically down to, well, let's automate everything? Even with new varieties of automation, there's still significant capital cost and maintenance cost of being able to do that. Is it as flexible and as good as, let's say, a more manual operation? And what you're going to end up is that you're going to have a hybrid to some extent. So it doesn't solve all of the problem. It solves part. It might be a significant part, but it only solves part of the problem. So, I mean, that impact of lack of profitability to me is quite fundamental. Now, whether or not I'm going to be able to persuade people that are buying logistics that they need to think more broadly about this, it's a hard call because every single business will have a cost down, but I would argue they should have a value up mentality that will lead them on occasions to make a decision that, well, I'm not suggesting they will, the people that have made those decisions will lay awake at night worrying desperately about whether or not they've done anything wrong. But it is not necessarily a decision that does the best overall for everybody.
I think we all realised as we went through the COVID pandemic just how fragile our supply networks are, but for all kinds of goods, whether it was food, toilet paper, chocolate, or anything, we just realized how reliant we were and how little inventory we actually have within the the network of supply. And as you say, I think, with that, we've compounded it somewhat by an ever-increasing move to online transaction, online shopping. And, we've gone in the reverse direction at the moment about, where the sort of efficiency of the supply chain maybe exists. So it sort of leads you into a really big challenge about how do you really make more out of the current supply chain designs that we have, but from a temporary position where we all realized exactly how fragile we were and how important truck drivers were, how important warehouse operators were, people who were going to pick your order. Having realized that we can't do any of those things without those people, we've then gone into a period of high inflation, and we've almost had to squeeze out something from exactly those people who are now sitting in the scenario of, well, is it really that attractive? I thought temporarily supply chain was going to be nice and attractive because everybody was realizing how important we were. And now we've gone through we've got to trim out all of the cost. And therefore, I think some of that groundswell of decency to really pay what is a proper, well-rewarded career, as I think you said, we've gone maybe slightly away from that now, and back into we're going to have to take out all of the costs that we possibly can just in order to retain what is a low margin and low profitability of the industry. So I think you're absolutely right that the fact that the industry is existing on a low margin just makes it incredibly difficult to go down the avenue of increasing some of these items, which might be all about the welfare of the people, rather than it being something which is just about the pockets of the shareholders.
I mean, totally agree. And here we're really focused on, probably as much as anything else, on contract logistics and medium to large scale logistics service providers. We can look at other areas whereby I always think, unless you're enormous and you're 100 million plus sort of account, you're going to get from the parcel providers what you're going to get. It's going to be a standardized product. You might get a few few add-ons, but that almost seems you've got a limited choice of, let's say, truly global parcel organizations within there, and that seems to be a little bit more of a dictated, this is what you're going to get. And I think ocean and air freight are interesting. I think that's more like going to a casino in Las Vegas on occasions and wondering what results are you actually going to get. And I don't think there are so many people that on either side that are winning the jackpot there, because it's a very volatile outcome. But zoning into the area that I've really sort of specified, what do I think the impacts are? I think it is stymieing these organisations' ability to invest in the future, when at the same time as that they've got some real challenges. And what are their defence against that? Well, probably to seek more mergers. And that is seemingly one of the key answers that is used, that if I have more of it, so therefore I'm going to be able to, as you said earlier, absorb my centralized cost. But are they being smart enough? And that's where I have some fundamental questions. And it's arrogant for me to call it out. I'm not working for them. I don't know all of the pressures and forces they have behind them. But I do wonder about how much are they truly leveraging their scale, and are they doing that intelligently enough? And I think that's a question that really does need an answer. But that sort of low profitability for me is concerning, in the sense of it doesn't allow us to get to a more sustainable future without an awful lot of perhaps even governmental intervention in order to perhaps be able to invest and focus attention. But what do you think needs to change, if anything?
There's a really long-term picture You take something like the sustainability challenges that are out there. You're absolutely right that companies aren't going to have the resources available to adequately invest in actually achieving net zero. It just doesn't appear to be something that, whilst people will invest what they can, there's probably an opportunity to actually optimize further, quicker, and be able to get much closer to net zero much quicker. But that all comes from actually taking a slightly different approach towards collaboration, maybe, and a slightly different approach to how we're able to optimize with some of our competitors. We have to almost temporarily forget the fact that whilst we're trying to make money and we might be trying to win as much business as we possibly can, the ideal people with whom you need to have a conversation to become more effective is to perhaps collaborate with some of your competitors. And having, with the benefits of technology these days, having more of an open platform where that type of collaboration is possible. And we've gone beyond the four walls of a particular LSP, and we're now sitting in a layer which is overarching multiple LSPs, so that we're really generating something which is beyond where we currently are in terms of our optimization capability. Now that, bear in mind how much empty running we think we've got, bearing in mind how many partial truckloads we think we've got, being able to reduce those two factors will generate an improved effectiveness, which in itself can generate a higher percentage margin, which in itself may be a way for us to then start looking at how do we invest in the long-term infrastructure to get to the next level. So, it's about starting a journey, but I think technology is there. But I think that we've got a mentality and a mindset which currently doesn't allow us to go there. It's like it's unheard of for us to think about how do we collaborate with our competitors. Not talking necessarily about financially, merging and that type of operation. Just how we can come together to create something which is a much more effective network. Because frankly, we're all trying to do the same thing, but it's just about creating a new kind of mantra of how could I get there? And I don't think that the LSPs really think about how they can do that. And I think that would be one sort of challenge. And when you mentioned earlier about, what would happen if you asked all of these questions to somebody who were working currently inside one of the key LSPs, they've probably got a very different view of it. I'm talking at this from the outside in, but it does raise these types of questions, because I know even 20 years ago, kind of work with multiple manufacturers who were all operating with different logistics service providers. We were trying to create a network which was more efficient because collectively we could. And it was just really difficult to get that to operation because everybody was thinking about, well, what am I losing? Fair enough, I'm going to gain some business from this other manufacturer who I don't currently have a contract with, but I'm going to lose some to this other LSP. And clearly they were all wanting to just defend what they had a little bit and not lose at least. They were quite happy to take a benefit, but they didn't want to lose. So that's all about the mindset and the mentality. If they'd have gone with it openly, it would have created something which was an awful lot more efficient than what was happening right now.
I don't disagree with you, but I suppose a lot of what you've said, because yes, I had similar involvement to your good self in trying to drive those activities. Were we successful? No. I'll be absolutely clear in terms of that. It didn't reach its potential. I sort of look at it and say I can see a path to logistics service providers doubling their EBITDA, but it takes some different think. And actually, their customers and suppliers need to really join in, I feel, a little bit of a debate, a think tank in terms of how could this be better. in a non-anti-competitive way. Because is the result that we achieve today optimal? Far from it. It is the best that can be achieved with the mindset and the technology we're applying now, but there are new technologies, and again I keep on making reference back. What are the superhuman questions we need to put to some of this new technology? And I do wonder whether or not we are focused enough on those working out what those superhuman questions are. But I might give an example of, what could be a working example of this sort of in action. And if you look at airlines and you look at the formation of code share and the alliances within there, now, there is an argument that is to the benefit of the consumer, meaning that I can travel further and easier on a single ticket, and I'm not too worried about the label on the outside of the plane. Yeah, some of the service elements are going to be slightly different, but it's going to be reasonably easy and convenient for me to book with one airline and go all the way through, and it doesn't matter which part of whatever alliance I'm going to be traveling with overall. In that sense, that probably is a reasonable worked example of how you've got an industry that has attempted to make itself more profitable, arguably more sustainable in terms of putting people on seats within planes and improving, if you like, load fill within there. That perhaps is one part of the answer. The other part of the answer, go and have a look at airlines again. Go and have a look at some of the low-cost airlines that are very, very good at sweating their assets and keeping them moving all the time. Again, I would then go and look at the logistics industry and say, it does a fantastic job. I am not meaning to talk down to anybody that is working within a logistics service provider now. The only thing I want to say to you is thank you for the job that you do. It really is appreciated. But we can always be better, and we can always think differently. And I think we're sort of at a stage whereby I think we need to dare to really challenge what are the existing norms, because I make reference to something called Pavlovian logistics. Now, it's not a dessert. It's more a salivating dog, as in Pavlov's dog. And I think we are trapped in this sort of Pavlovian straight Groundhog Day, whereby, we issue a tender, the tender is responded to. Perhaps there isn't enough reflection on how well does this new piece of business for the logistics service provider overall improve their network balance, and overall is the hidden profit available to them within there? How effective is that? What are the indications beyond conversation that I would have that there is potential for this? Is that how many logistics service providers are having their business on a single platform with visibility across their organisation? I think there are very few. Perhaps you don't need to have a single platform, but you do need to have a single point of visibility. How many logistics service providers are targeting proactively that business that would make that real difference to their network and balance it, and therefore become more profitable? And are they making enough use, and data confidentiality accepted? Are they making enough use of the big data that they're in possession of all the time, both in terms of the live contracts that they have, but also those contracts that they didn't win, but the actual distribution information contained therein? So I didn't win it, and it might be for a 3-year contract, but actually that distribution data is going to be certainly perhaps 80%, maybe even 90% accurate when this comes around again in 3 years' time. I think the other point in terms of this is that sort of commoditisation effect, whereby we repeat the same old tenders. And I've heard this directly from 3PLs. They say, well, we know the difference between a serious tender and a benchmarking tender. And so there's a question to the buyer, which is, if you just want a benchmark, well, find a different way of benchmarking than wasting the time of logistics service providers on tenders that you've got no intention of awarding any business to. But also think about things a little bit differently. I think that we need a broader industry conversation because I recently interviewed Richard Smith, Managing Director of the RHA, and one of the things that I found that was really sad was that, we had over 400 haulage companies go to the wall last year, and this year it's going to be closer to 600. And when they're gone, they're gone. And that actually is, it is a resource that all the larger providers actually need to be able to perform services, so it is important. I do then look at profitability, about how much of that profitability is a cost of cash, as it were, because that cost of cash on the basis of quite stretched payment terms. So if you're looking at the sort of length of payment terms that some logistics service providers are being paid on, that has to be factored in as well. Now, whether or not that's completely factored, that's for their own treasury to work out what is appropriate within there. But I look at all sorts of levers that all the industry stakeholders that should be pulling, they should be having conversations, they should be really trying to look and think a little bit differently. Because if they carry on in this direction, what are we going to end up with? There's one argument that says, you're going to have, maybe 25 years' time, you're going to have such consolidation in the industry, you might have 4 or 5 major globals that are running most of our logistics. And watch out for that, because that will be the backwash. And the backwash will be is that, using those examples of perhaps the ocean freight and the parcel industry, it means that then all of a sudden the buying power changes. And the buying power, it's the power of the seller, not the power of the buyer, that drives those.
No, and you're in that vicious cycle of where you are such a small fish in terms of their overall operation that, actually probably that's why a good number of these fairly bespoke boutique operators came to fruition, because frankly, people were getting the lower end of the service expectations that they wanted and were willing to go and pay a premium in many ways to a smaller provider in order to make sure they've got that service. And it reminds me as well about, sort of speciality supply chains. There are certain supply chains, whether that's chilled or frozen or something like that, where most of these operators sort of do exist. But there are an awful lot of other things like dangerous goods where you can only get so far with the boundaries that those operations have. And there's got to be some sort of journey that if you go down a consolidation route and you end up with 4 or 5 great big global operators, then they're going to have to diversify into some of those more speciality businesses and to a larger extent, provide those services. And of course, that is actually probably where there are higher margins than the average. So, maybe there's a bit of a virtuous circle here of, that might still seem something which the largest providers find quite attractive by taking on business which is in a different sector to what they've previously had. But I just think if you're a buyer of services and you're a fairly small buyer of services, beware if we don't look at the margin of the smaller providers.
Absolutely agreed. So we're coming towards the end of this. If we had a magic wand, what would we change? Well,
I think I alluded it to a little bit earlier. I think that we recognise that logistics service providers are not getting an appropriate level of margin, but it isn't as simple as being able to increase it because of the way that the market dynamic goes. I do think that with the advent of technology and with a change in mindset through, you mentioned the word think tank, but something which is definitely a multi-party, how can we do this better approach. I do think that there are opportunities to become more efficient, to become more effective, and use that in a way to create the investments that are required in other ways to be able to generate a higher margin. So I think if there were one thing that I would imagine we almost need to start from is use our current infrastructure better. And then at least we've got something by way of a war chest to go and be able to develop, whether it's the sustainability side of it or whether it's taken into higher margin. I think that those are, it just sort of feels as if it all starts from from the mentality and our approach and not carry on doing the same things that we have been doing in terms of issuing and responding to tenders. So I think that would be if I waved my wand, it would be try to get us to think in that way.
Well, my wishes and my magic wand apply this way. I would love to have another session here, and I'm issuing an open invitation to anybody that has either currently, which is less likely, or used to work for a logistics service provider that would feel able to come and express an opinion in this area. I would warmly, and I think Keith would too, warmly welcome you to come and have a discussion and to get you to come on and tell us why we're wrong. I'm perfectly happy to listen always to why I'm wrong. My other key wishes would be we have research and development tax credits for a reason. And I think there is a necessity to really more deeply research the working relationships between logistics providers and their customers, how their business development actually works and is targeted, and also how might we develop mutually rewarding collaborations that would improve profitability and sustainability. I think that would be a real supporting issue of, perhaps an initial development of a think tank, and let's actually feed that think tank with real and meaningful information so a decision can be made. And finally, I'm always going to put the flag up in terms of procurement, and I would just say to the logistics service providers generally, whenever in the past, when I've been working for your customers, I've expressed a point of interest in understanding how you buy, because you were bound to be much bigger than what I was doing at that time, the door was slammed firmly shut. And whenever somebody is reluctant to talk about something, it could be for a number of reasons. It could be that, this is proprietary, it's commercially sensitive, or it could be that you're a bit embarrassed about it. And I think it's actually a combination of really all three. And my suspicion is that if you really focused on how, in an intelligent way, and in the broadest use of the term procurement, the full discipline, which is not just about the sourcing, it's understanding spend, it's building strategy, and it's how you actually manage and reward your supply base. I think if you focused on that, that could actually be quite transformational. Or am I barking up the wrong tree, Keith, do you think?
I don't think so. I don't think so at all. Makes a lot of sense.
So with that sort of shocking conclusion of agreement, we need to learn how to argue better, myself and Keith. We can't be doing this going forward. I would like to thank Keith so much for the time that he regularly invests in coming to chat to me. So thank you very much, Keith.
No problem at all. Thank you for the invitation.
You're most welcome. That concludes this episode of Logistics Collective, the podcast. If you are interested in being alerted about any subsequent podcasts, we're available on the vast majority of podcast platforms, also available on YouTube. And if you like and follow us on there, you'll get updates when we're issuing a new episode. Or indeed, you can come and visit and be more interactive with us on logisticscollective.com. Thanks ever so much for listening, and I hope the rest of your working weeks in advance of our next podcast prove fruitful, interesting, and since it's summer in the UK in 2024, we'd like to actually have some warmer weather. So that's all that I wish for between now and the next podcast. So thanks ever so much. Bye for now.
You can get in contact by email, podcast@logisticscollective.com, or leave a voice message on our website, logisticscollective.com. The podcast is a production by Laguru.